member from Prince Edward Hastings.
Thanks, Speaker. My question this morning is for the Premier. Thanks to this morning's Liberal scheme, we now know that Ontarians are going to be on the hook for another $42 billion in brand-new interest costs in Ontario. And the Premier said this morning she can't even guarantee long-term relief for ratepayers. That's because they're pushing even more of these expensive FIT contracts onto the grid tomorrow. These are the same types of contracts that got us in this mess in the first place. Speaker, if you're spending $42 billion of today's money to pay for yesterday's mistakes, how much more are we going to have to pay for the mistakes that you're about to make tomorrow?
Good question.
Thank you. Premier, the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So obviously, the honourable member hasn't actually really looked at the plan, because he would then understand that what we're talking about, Mr. Speaker, is $25 billion over 30 years. We're making sure, Mr. Speaker, that one generation does not pay for something that will be used by many generations, Mr. Speaker. We're offloading those costs and making sure, Mr. Speaker, that everyone will pay their fair share, because we're making the system fair, Mr. Speaker. 25% reduction right across the board for every ratepayer, Mr. Speaker. But I know, Mr. Speaker, he keeps talking about our FIT contracts and all of those bad contracts that he likes to frame, Mr. Speaker. But I know yesterday, when he was talking on CFRA's show in Ottawa, out of his mouth, Mr. Speaker, he said ripping up these contracts would come at a huge cost to taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And we agree, Mr. Speaker. We are making sure that we have a fair system in place, Mr. Speaker, one that is helping 25% reductions right across.
Thank you. Supplementary.
You know, in a radio interview a couple of weeks ago, the Energy Minister for the Liberals called London listeners dumb, Mr. Speaker. That's what he's done. $42 billion in new interest costs, and the big power company friends who gave $1.3 million to the government aren't going to be out of a dime. 64% of the costs in the electricity sector come from generators, and guess who's not going to be affected? Their Liberal friends. The generators are not going to be affected as a result of this scheme today. In fact, a bunch of them are getting new approvals for plans tomorrow to build more of these things. 6 times in her press availability, the Premier said she made a mistake. But if you keep doing the same thing, it's not a mistake, it's negligence, and it's been negligence from this government for years now. Will the government fix the underlying problem? Or are we going to continue robbing Peter's grandkids to pay Paul's grandkids by 2030?
Good question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's actually this government is making sure we look after Peter's grandparents and Paul's grandparents and their grandkids, Mr. Speaker, by reducing rates and eliminating coal, Mr. Speaker. They forget about that. There's substantial reductions that we have made, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we make sure that our children have clean air to breathe, Mr. Speaker. That's something that they never worried about, Mr. Speaker. They actually left the system in tatters, Mr. Speaker. When they are talking about renewable energy, Mr. Speaker, they completely forget about 42,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker, that were created in this sector. They forget about billions and billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, that were made in investing in this province. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we have now brought forward a plan that will make sure that we have an affordable system, we have a clean system, and we have a green system, something that is the envy of not only this country but the world, Mr. Speaker.